Hi, I'm going to read you my essay on change. Here's a visual. It's 11 pages long, and it lays out 4 different models of change that I investigated and put together for myself. I didn't get this information by doing research and summarizing what others have written about change. I did this investigation because I'm an Alexander teacher, and this conversation came up on our Alexander training course. And for that reason, I have not edited out the references to the Alexander technique. But this is really applicable to anyone and everyone and is not limited to students of the Alexander technique nor teachers of the Alexander technique. But I've left those references in because they are contextual, and I'll mention names. These are people that were perhaps on the training course at the time and so on. And thank you for being interested in this topic and for listening to me today. I will be reading, so there's no need to watch this as a video unless you like to do that and want to do that. You could lie down and relax in semi-supine, which is an Alexander way of lying down called the constructive rest position, or you can sit in the chair, or you could be driving and listening to this content. It will not be soporific. And you could be going about some daily chores. I know that people like to listen and not only just to watch. Or you can read the article instead, if that's your preference. I know it's an age zone kind of thing. People of different ages like to approach material in different ways. So here it is. I'm simply going to read the paper to you and allow you to absorb the information in your own way, in your own time. Very good. Change. We glibly say that the Alexander technique is about changing habitual patterns. But what does that actually mean? The habitual patterns part we can sort of explain, but the change part is more challenging to explain. As Alexander teaches, we don't spend nearly as much time considering the meaning of change as we do exploring the meaning of habitual patterns. You are probably about to discover that you don't actually have a structured way to think about change because you previously assumed, because you previously assumed that you understood the meaning of the word change. We have a lot of adages and proverbs in our society about change. Although these expressions tend to be antithetical, paradoxically there are situations in which each one will be true. For example, on the one hand, there's a sense, even an ethic in our society, that you have to change. You are either going to change or it's going to be forced upon you. On the other hand, when we're hoping and trusting and wishing that someone will change, we hear the dire proverb, "A leopard doesn't change its spots." These competing truths generate confusion, and so it is important for us to understand change in a systematic way, since that is what we are seeking to teach. We need to sort through what can and what can't realistically be expected to change, and we need also to understand how a process of change proceeds. When it comes to understanding change, the first thing that one needs to understand is the complexity of why you are the way you are, because that complexity comes into play when you go to make a change. Firstly, it determines what you are changing from. And secondly, it determines what you think your choices are and how you make a choice. I encourage you to think a lot about this complexity. You can see that people get set in a mold at some very early stage of life. I think Freud said that our psyches are done developing by age 7. Our psyches are then set, and it's going to be very hard to truly change our makeup and our personalities and our psychology and even our outlook on life and our interests once we are past 7. Besides the influence of the first 7 years of our lives, So much of who we are is already determined by our genetics, inherited from our parents and our ancestors. It isn't clear how much of who we are is determined by genetic versus by the environment. When I studied psychology, that's exactly where we began. Psychology 1, first day, first week, first psychology course, we started with the nature-nurture debate, which I should have taken as a sign that this was an argument beyond resolve, because that is what it is. Nature versus nurture doesn't take any account of cognition. You know that was the part that was missing for me when I learned about behaviorism and reinforcement. After we learned about conditioned behavior, we learned about cognition, and the Alexander technique falls there, into the field of cognition. There is such a thing as cognitive behavior, where consciousness can mediate between nature, instinct, and nurture, conditioning, by the environment, and presumably cognition gives you conscious choice. But that throws you right back to the nature-nurture debate. You see, for what then motivates your choice? How do you make choices? And even more interesting than that, for us Alexander teachers, how do you choose something that you don't know about? And if you can't choose something you don't know about, if it's not given to you as a choice, then how can you say that what you are choosing is a choice? Are you limited to what's shown to you, or given to you, or role modeled for you, or imprinted on you one way or another? Even once someone has committed to change, there are still barriers to overcome. This is an opportunity for me to share my very most favorite line of all. Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. This aspect of change is extremely problematic because most people don't want to let go of anything in their process of change. They don't want to give up anything. They just want the new good part to come their way. I think it might be symbolic in our society that when you get change for money, you end up with less. I think that imprints itself in a very deep fashion on our concept of change. We think we are going to lose something, and we think we are going to end up with less. Think about it. When you are faced with change, for some unknown reason, change does include a sense of diminishment in some way, plus a sense that there is a judgment on what has been and a fear of what is to come. There is definitely a pervading fear of losing something of yourself. Yes, you have to give up something for an unknown return, and this poses a very big obstacle to change. Another obstacle to change is what I call the river of shit. What you want is on the other side of the river of shit, but nobody wants to wade through the river of shit. That's a reason why people don't change. They don't want to take on tasks or responsibilities or even ideas that are essential to the desired change. So when people come to you and they say that they want change, it's a good idea to ask yourself a few questions bearing the preceding information in mind. Does this person really want to change? Can this person change? How much can this person change? Would you reject a student because you didn't think she was capable of much change? Certainly not. Perhaps if the person is incapable of any change, you would want to refer her on to a more appropriate modality. But if the person can benefit from the Alexander technique, even despite being perhaps too old or too sick to change much, you would still want to give that person the opportunity of deriving as much benefit as possible. There are 4 models of change that can help Alexander teachers choose an appropriate intention of change and map a course of change for their students. 4 models of change. Note, to help with the thought process as we go through this, you might want to think of something that you would like to change about yourself. Preferably something that you have had an ongoing struggle with, a habitual pattern of functioning that interferes with your quality of life. It could be the way you think about something, or the way you worry about something, or the way you do something, or the way you interact with somebody. It could be anything. It's just a habitual pattern of functioning. That habitual pattern will become the yardstick to which you can apply the models of change that we're talking about. First model, a continuum. Each end is the opposite of the other. Our first model is one we are very accustomed to. We begin with a quality, like tense, and then we gradually change, moving along a continuum, gradually become less and less tense until eventually we are relaxed, the opposite quality at the other end of the continuum. This is quantitative change, where we do less of something we don't want and more of something that we do want. That's a quantitative adjustment, which can eventually become a qualitative change. This might be the least powerful version of change, because you can go back and forth between the bigger quantity and the lesser quantity too easily. You are still in the same worldview or paradigm. You're just operating along a continuum. Quantitative change versus qualitative change deserves contemplation, because qualitative change denotes a different way of being in the world. And it's a big question. How does qualitative change come about? And is it actually possible? Or is it only quantitative change that's possible? When thinking about quantitative versus qualitative change, it is helpful to think about water. At 0 degrees Fahrenheit, water is ice. With the application of heat, the ice will get warmer but will still be ice. There is a long latent phase while heat is applied, and then at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the ice will begin to melt, changing in quality from solid to liquid. With the further application of heat, all the ice will become water, and more heat will cause the water to boil, causing a further change in quality to vapor. Second model, metamorphosis, growth. The second model of change is metamorphosis or growth. One might question whether metamorphosis is really change, since it's growth. It's inherent. It's programmed into the system, and it's in the DNA. It's in the blueprint, and it's meant to be happening. But what happens in life is we get blocked or we get stuck, and that metamorphosis can't progress. So our job, as Alexander teaches, is to unblock the inherent growth process. And that, of course, is how Alexander teachers understand their work. Inhibiting what is interfering with the natural order. Now, take a moment and look at your habitual pattern that you've been wanting to address and see. Is this a question of blocked metamorphosis, blocked growth? Many of us are stuck at age 3 or 6 or 13 or 18 in our development, and we still have got habitual patterns that were established at those ages that we haven't overcome. I would go so far as to say that all of us will have habitual patterns that are to do with blocked metamorphosis. We are just looking at the one that you happen to choose today. And is it a question of blocked metamorphosis? You can say perhaps. You don't have to go yes or no. You can do a perhaps, because obviously the question and answer are not going to stop here today. You are going to carry on thinking about this hopefully after this. Sometimes we just want to resist going into the responsibilities of the next stage of our development, and that's a form of blocking too. Model 3, Yin-Yang conversion. The next model of change is the Yin-Yang model, And in this model, the thing changes into its opposite. So that is a big qualitative change. For example, the untidy teenager turns into a neat adult. There's an actual moment where the conversion or transition occurs. That moment and how it is reached is what we need to identify, both as Alexander teachers and as practitioners of change in our personal lives. The moment where the thing becomes its opposite. Take a look at the yin-yang diagram. The white just becomes black. There's no gray, there's no gradual transition. It's as if the white runs its course and then turns black. As Ellen pointed out, this is what happened when Paul fell off his donkey on the way to Damascus. That was the beginning of Christianity. Paul, who was a persecutor of Christians, became totally won over and became the opposite. He became Saint Paul. In South Africa, F.W. de Klerk, who was the Prime Minister, elected by the apartheid system, led the country into giving up apartheid. He denied having a vision of seeing the light, but something happened. He decided to let every white holder of a South African passport, no matter where in the world, vote in a referendum. The referendum was not held along constituency lines, but as a populist vote. Even the system of voting was changed in order to bring about change. And that is how the white people of South Africa voted to give up power and domination of the black people. On a more mundane level, think about your hair. You have a hairstyle and it grows long and out of shape. The moment of it being longest and most out of shape is right next to the moment of it being cut back and becoming at its most styled and in shape. The thing runs its course and then it switches. And that's the yin-yang model. And of course we know in the yin-yang model also that the thing contains the seed of the opposites. In the yin-yang diagram, the white side contains the seed of black, and the black side contains the seed of white. And that's why I always say that the thing and its opposite live in the same space. I had a client in South Africa who was in a big research survey company, and he came up with something that changed market research around the globe. And that was the conversion model. Because when you want someone to switch his brand of soap, you have to convert him. People don't change which soap they use very easily. They don't change their toothpaste. This, of course, is what marketing is about, getting people to change their brand. That is a conversion process. What actually will get someone to change is a big, big question. Just take a moment and think about a time when you converted from one way of thinking to another way of thinking, or from one allegiance to another allegiance, and ask yourself, what was the trigger? What happened in that moment? Because that is your avenue for starting to understand change. So, you've got to think of an example where you did change. You did convert. There are two standard triggers for conversion: inspiration and desperation. Take a moment to consider which one of these two triggers you into action, or under which circumstances in your life that one has operated as the trigger, and under which circumstances the other has operated. When dealing with a new student, it is quite insightful to assess whether inspiration or desperation has brought your student to the Alexander technique. Fourth model, the spiral of change. And now comes the fourth model. And this is the model that we adhere to without realizing it in the Alexander technique. This model includes all the elements of the previous three models, the spiral of change. I wasn't satisfied with either metamorphosis or yin-yang as applying in wholeness and completion to the Alexander technique, or even to change in general. It seemed like something was missing. The insight as to what was missing came after reading Harville Hendricks' book, Getting the Love You Want. This is an excellent and insightful book that I recommend to everyone, but I must admit that I became very depressed after reading it because it felt like life is just a trap, impossible to get out of. All we can expect is to go round and round in a circle, a cycle, or as we usually say, a rut. Basically, Hendricks' thesis, which I find absolutely no argument with, unfortunately, is that we marry the very thing that is going to drive us insane with hatred. When I read this book, I recognized that this is absolutely true and correct. You will either marry your mother or your father or some combination of both because you are on this relentless path to resolve those difficulties in your life. The book expresses a truth, but it is one of those truths that makes you sick. After feeling down in the dumps for a while, I realized that even though these were inescapable truths, there are still levels, and that we can grow or change toward the light, away from the low, dark levels of these truths, and that this growth is in the form of a spiral. So the fourth model is the spiral of change, and this is where the continuum of change, metamorphosis, and yin-yang change can integrate. In a spiral of change, you start at point A, square one, and you travel around. You cycle around. You experiment with being the opposite, and then you cycle around and you come back to point A. Yet although you are at point A, it is not square one. There has been a development and there has been progress. This point corresponds to point A, but it is at a progressed level. You are further along on the spiral. It can look like you are back at the same place, but you're not. You may be using the same words and seem to be saying the same thing, but it's not really the same. It's not point A. You just spiraled back around to something that looks or sounds or feels similar, but it isn't the same place. In fact, you've traversed quite an extent and gone through quite a cycle of learning. You've processed, you've learned, you've progressed. There are quantitative differences and there are qualitative differences. There has been development. Perhaps you find yourself using the same words, but they have acquired new meaning to you. More insight, more depth, more dimension. I have found that the very words habitual patterns have developed more and more meaning for me as I've progressed along a spiral of development as an Alexander teacher. Now, of course, some people are just going around in a rut. We do have to have ways to distinguish just going around and around from a spiral of development. This is a very practical need in teaching, where you have to be alert to real change versus moving the problem around. For example, people who hold their necks tense might free their necks, but then tighten up lower down, say through the thoracic spine. They give up holding their head and neck so tight, but they hold on somewhere else instead. You have to watch out for that in your students and even in yourself. Most people will, at least in the beginning, allow some release in the upper half of the body, but will compensate by stiffening in the lower half. And then when you move on to releasing the lower half of their body, they will move back to stiffening the upper half, because they can't actually let go and really allow change. Instead, they just move the holding from one place to another. What are some ways to ascertain whether we're in a cycle, circle, or a spiral? Well, for one thing, we do know that if we are in a different place, the view will look different. The perspective will change. If you're on the ground floor of a building with a river view, when you look out of the window at the river, you will get a different sight from when you're looking out in the same direction from the 8th floor. Another big marker that you are in a different place in the spiral is that accompanying or associated thoughts and attitudes are different. That's a big one. It's the difference from traveling from here to my house when it's pouring rain and when it's a sunny day. That kind of difference. The terrain can seem the same, and yet the light is different. The mood is different, as if you have different eyes even. The change can be very tangible, especially when you have had skill development. You can find yourself in the same situation, yet with new skills, you have resources and self-empowerment that you didn't previously have. One year, you could find yourself stuck on the side of the road with a flat tire, no spare, and a dead battery in your cell phone. You learn from that. You get a cell phone charger for your car. You join AAA. You keep a viable spare in the trunk. The next year, you get a flat tire again. But this time, you aren't stuck. You're equipped. You know what to do. You are educated. Let's use an Alexander example. Somebody comes to you and she's got headaches. And the headaches start to clear up and they are feeling better. And then, whoa! 6 months later, she gets a spate of headaches again. Has she gone back to square one? Or is she just in a different place in the spiral? It's important to know. Then, instead of it taking 6 months to get some relief from the headaches, it takes only 6 days. That's an indicator that she is in a different place in the spiral. Progressing out of the headaches was much quicker. That is a tangible difference, indicating real change. Once a teacher has some experience under her belt, she can usually tell within 6 lessons whether the student is going to make progress with the Alexander technique. Certainly the issues of use won't yet be resolved, but certainly some tangible progression along the spiral of change should be observable. I think this is comforting. I would prefer to know sooner rather than later whether the Alexander technique is the right method for helping someone. When students are coming for lessons in order to deal with resolving symptoms, I do tell them that we will be able to tell after 6 lessons whether they are in the right place at the right time. Now that is a little Alexander technique specific. So think about any modality that you know that you're doing and think, how long does it take to be able to evaluate, am I getting real change? Thank you.